Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Kate Oakley.
And Kate, you have a very office-like background today.
I do, yes, sadly. I'm sitting in my office at the University of Glasgow, which you can't actually see out the window because of where this computer is placed. If you could, you could see a sort of building site with some nice kind of, fake medieval buildings in the far bit, and then the kind of modern bit of the university right in front of me. So there's a nice kind of ballet at the moment of various kind of diggers and things moving around, producing yet another anonymous university building right in front of the anonymous university building that I'm currently sitting in.
Which looks fairly modern.
Yeah, it is. No, it
Yeah.
is. It's a sort of This building is kind of when did it open? 3 or 4 years ago. It's like a sort of standard office building with pods and chill out zones and
Oh
places where
God.
you're meant to go and innovate with other people and stuff like that. It does actually have offices with books in as well, to be fair,
Oh,
but there
that's
are quite a lot of pods.
it has pods and shells. Does it have hot desking?
It has hot desking.
Oh,
It does have hot desking. That's mostly for students, God love them, and itinerant staff who are maybe here for a short bit. And then there are these odd single-person offices. Mine has a couch in right in front of the window, so that anyone could see you if you dare to lie down and have a kip, sort of thing. So I've never dared to do it. And a small table, but it does have sort of bookcase. It's fine, and it's kind of. So in this university, you're either in the old bit, which is lovely but has mice and the
Hmm.
Wi-Fi doesn't work very well, or you're in the new bit, which is anonymous but the Wi-Fi works and that
Soulless.
kind of thing.
And does it
Yeah.
have signs on the wall that say things like "Be you and be better" and "Be your future" and this sort of
No,
thing?
no, no, you wouldn't get away with that. It's got a bit of art. There's a
Oh,
sort of
okay.
art budget, so it's got a few sort of bits of art and things like that. But yes, no, it doesn't have signs on the encouraging signs or anything,
Well, that's a
or it doesn't
plus.
say you have to be mad, don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps type thing either.
Or yeah. So, Prof, last time we emailed, you used an expression about yourself akin to winding down. Now, this is winding down is not something I associate with you. So,
Right.
in that context, let me pose to you my standard opening gambit, which is, would you share with us what's currently winding you down, winding you up, dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you? What's going on? Is it the sectarianism of Celtic and Rangers?
No, not that. Although I can talk about that if you want. I mean, partly I'm slightly dynamized by being on a podcast, Toby. I think this may be the first podcast I've ever been on in my life. And indeed, I almost never, I don't, in the world of podcasting, I'm like a high court judge when it comes to podcasting. It's kind of like, will it catch on, is my question. Do you know what I mean? I never listen to them. I've never been on one. I've never made one. So I'm quite excited about this. I'm kind of imagining it's a bit like Desert Island Discs. And at the end, you ask me what my favorite book is and what luxury I will take to the island. But obviously, that doesn't happen. So that's been quite exciting. Why did I said I was winding down? Because at the end of this calendar year, I'm going down to kind of part-time working as a sort of, I suppose, way into it in some point in the future to kind of retiring altogether because I'm very old.
It's interesting you say that about Roy Plumley, because when I started the podcast in 2010, I modeled it on Desert Island Discs.
Oh, really?
And what I did was to invite people to choose their favorite music, and they would come to my loft and we would put it on while we spoke.
Oh,
And I
how lovely.
cut it so that I thought it would fit what would be legit. Because as you may know, in the podcast version of Desert Island Discs, they only play a certain percentage of the
Yes,
music
for rights reasons,
for
I think.
rights
Is that correct?
reasons.
Yes.
But then I checked with my friendly neighborhood copyright lawyer, Bill Grantham,
Oh, yes.
and a Hollywood attorney, and he said, what the BBC can get away with on a podcast, you can't.
Oh, I see. Oh, so you had to ditch the music.
I had to ditch them. So people were not on a desert island. They did not have the music. They did not have the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare. And they could not have a luxury item. which in Tom Hanks' case was probably a Wilson volleyball. So in any
Was
event, I I had to change it, but it's interesting that that comes to mind for you. Um, I at the moment there's this strange thing where, as you may or may not know, the BBC not iPlayer, that's never been available, but the Sounds app
Yes,
doesn't work outside Britain
yes,
anymore.
I
So
know.
we can't listen to fucking anything except
But you can't, isn't there some kind of sort of cut down, slightly bastardized version of things that you can get where
this
you
is
can
what the
get?
BBC keeps saying. There
Ah, I
isn't.
see. Oh,
It's a
really? There's no
lie.
thing. Oh, okay.
You can listen via the web to the World Service and Radio 4. So you can be improved.
That's basically
It,
all you need, though. Let's be honest. I mean, come on,
well,
that's fair enough, isn't it?
absolutely. So
Really,
in other words, the spirit of Lord Reith emanates
Thank God for that.
across the island nation and out to the uncivilized world. And there is a lot of uplift going on. The trouble
Good,
is,
good, good,
I
good.
want
Let's
Radio
face it, you don't want
Bloke.
Peaky Blinders, do you? Really? Let's be honest. You don't
I
want any
want
kind of dross. You want, high-minded things.
I want Radio Bloke.
Oh, you can't get that. That's true. You can't get Radio Bloke, and
Now
you can't get
couldn't get
Dave from
Radio
Bagman.
Bloke with cricket or football, but you could get the rest of Radio Bloke.
Oh, so you could never get TMS. You couldn't get Test Match Special.
No, well, TMS you could get. This is the cricket commentary for the three listeners and the
For
dogs.
people who've already switched off.
That you could get through YouTube. The
Ah,
BBC
okay.
provided an audio link to Test Match Special through YouTube. Quite crazy. I didn't understand that at all. So very annoying. Through the World Service, and this is very much like the BBC Radio when we were children, Kate. Through the World Service, you get every Saturday, the second half of a Premier League game described. So you get Radio Bloke filtered through the World Service
Okay.
for the second half on a
But
Saturday.
ball by ball kind of commentary on it.
It is the Radio Bloke commentary.
Right,
And
okay.
Radio Bloke says things occasionally like, and for World Service listeners.
Aston Villa is in, Birmingham or something like
So
that.
we know we're not forgotten completely as our civilization is slowly Reithian raised.
Well, I like to think of you tuning in on a kind of, London Calling kind of app from someone, whatever the equivalent is, to listen to the second half of, Millwall plays whoever.
It is appalling. It is appalling. I mean, really, and honestly, it not being able to listen to, obviously I don't listen to Radio 1, but or 2, but the others I do listen to, actually. 6 Extra and all that.
And do you know, as a person who knows about these things, what has brought this about at the BBC?
My understanding is that it's one of their saving money.
Okay.
And so the way it's been described by BBC people is that, we are targeting our soft power more tightly.
So where's it going? Where's the soft power going?
It's just a bunch of Tory boys who run the BBC. It always has been like that. And they are scrimping on this and they're scrimping on local radio. They're trying to destroy local radio.
Yeah. Indeed. Going the way of local newspapers, which have somewhat gone away a long time ago.
Yeah, and really, the local radio should be expanding what it does, given local newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Although a lot of that's gone online, I believe, but a little bit in the way of podcasts. I don't read a lot of only online media. I actually read a physical newspaper every day still.
Yeah,
and I listen to the wireless and I watch television on an actual box.
But is the newspaper the Graniad?
Well, it used to be, but I've switched to the FT. And I go online for the Guardian sports coverage.
Right.
I love the Guardian sports coverage, but I cannot bear the endless litany of articles about the psychological lives of its journalists, their family, their children's trauma, the fact that their mother, endless psychological whining.
It is a bit like a WhatsApp girls group, isn't it?
It is. It's unbelievable. I think the moment I decided I couldn't read anymore was the morning after Trump was re-elected in last November, which kind of happened overnight in the UK, and you woke up in the sort of dark and gloom of that dreadful morning. I went onto the Guardian site, and the first article that I saw said, "I am losing my hair with anxiety about this."
Yeah, no.
That was literally the first. I mean, there were other articles that told me slightly more about it, but this was the first thing that I encountered, and I thought, I cannot be doing with this. I need something that someone's going to tell me about something that's actually in the world outside of their own psyche. And the FT does admirably, actually, but it has no sport.
I have the cheapskate online FT subscription where they select 8 articles a day for me.
Oh, do they?
That I get access to. And actually, that's pretty good. It's strange that there's no sport, or very little. There is that guy, Cooper, the Dutch.
Yes, they write. Yes, indeed. He writes about football. But he doesn't do sort of match reports, does he? He just does kind of.
Trevor Bailey used to be the FT's cricket correspondent.
Yes, I know. I don't know why they gave up writing about sport, actually.
Well, he burned to death with his wife.
Well, yes, but that wasn't why the FT didn't replace him, presumably, was it? I don't think. I don't know why it doesn't do sport. I mean, the Guardian does sport really well. I love the Guardian sports writers, so I don't mind.
I have a particular dislike of Barney Ronay.
Really? You don't like Barney? Why not?
He I think the expression is he overwrites. Too many metaphors, too many similes.
He does, but
in the same way that I actually hated Neville Cardus.
But when he says that Arteta is patrolling up and down the line like a sniper at a PTA meeting, you must admit that sometimes they're good. And I can never see Arteta and not think about that. He does.
There are 5 of them in a paragraph.
There are 5 of them in a paragraph, yes. But sometimes they're really good. So, I don't mind that, and I quite like his. I quite like the fact he's sort of, yes, I quite like him. I think Jonathan Lee is really good. I think Wilson's really good. I think generally speaking, the Guardian's sports writing is pretty good, actually, and the FT doesn't do it. So I do read both.
And their cricket is good. They don't have enough of it, but their cricket's good.
Yes, it is. So, it is. And probably really does some of their cricket stuff.
What is the FT for you? What does it give you? But I mean, I
like the
Martin
kind of
Wolf.
material account of the world. I think there's a good reason why the FT has always been loved by market liberals on one hand and kind of Marxists on the other, because it gives you a very material account of the world. Who's in, who's out, who wins, who loses, whose interests are represented in a particular moment. So you have to kind of acknowledge the politics of it and the position where it's coming from. But that's quite easy to do because it's very explicit. It's a kind of liberal, or almost 19th century kind of liberal paper in many ways. And it's very global. It tells you about actual things that are happening in the world. And it tends not to fuse. It's just less moralistic than The Guardian, which I quite like. And it fuses its news stories are still somewhat more distinct from its editorial, which I feel fused together too much everywhere else kind of thing. So there's a sort of, this happened and this is what, and then on another page, this is what we think about it. And generally, of course, the answer is always, what will the market think about it? What will the market think about X, Y, and Z? We know that's coming, but that's fine. I can live with that sort of thing because I can kind of correct for it. But I just can't stand the internal agonizing of Guardian journalists anymore, really.
No, I agree. And I think this is my biggest dislike of progressive media, really across the worlds and the languages that I know, that there's just too much opinion.
Yeah, there is.
Not enough reporting. And I realize this is partly a political economic pressure, particularly an economic one. One of the things I find interesting is the FT on Saturday. It comes out 6 days a week, when it's quite clear that capitalists just get drunk and eat a lot. Because it tells you at a sort of symptomatic level how these people live their lives.
Yes,
they are just served by others.
Yes,
and Saturday instructs them on how to do it.
Yes, it does, and I even find that quite joyous because the Guardian equivalent of that would be somebody saying, "I have discovered skiing in order to recover from my breast cancer, mother dying, child, whatever it is." It's always a recovery from trauma that leads you to some kind of consumer behavior in the Guardian. Whereas in the FT, it's just like, I fucking love skiing, And here I'm going to tell you about Val d'Isère this year. Yeah. And again, I kind of think I prefer that almost.
I know.
The fact that people do things for the sheer joy of them, and as you say, in order to be served by the rest of the world. And I've learned enormously useful things about like what people keep in their fridges and various rich people keep in their fridges. And
Well, they occasionally they do things about super yachts, which I really love because these are some of my pet hates
yes,
that I write about and attack. But of course, I've never been on one and I never will.
no,
So the fact that they go in and tell you what actually happens in excruciating ethnographic detail, and you can tell some of the people at the FT are on the left. It's very clear. You
yes, or at least they're kind of or yes, they're not on the right, are they? Always,
know,
it
no,
has got a very strong liberal
well, they might
kind of
be
thing.
19th century liberals. Yeah, okay. So
Yes,
19th century British liberal.
yes,
But I think some are actually on the left because there's this
yes.
irony in the tone sometimes.
Yes, there is. Yes, no,
That I
indeed,
really
indeed.
like.
So,
I subscribe and have for years to The Economist.
mhm.
And again, its editorial line is actually worse than the FT.
Worse than the FT. I've always found it worse than
It
the
is
FT. And
absolutely
again,
worse.
because it's a magazine rather than newspaper, there's less reporting and there is more opinion.
Well, it does call itself a newspaper, remember.
But do you not find that it's
It
the opinion
refers
bleeds
to
through
itself
more
as a
in the
paper.
Economist?
But I think, yes, most of the opinion stuff from different parts of the world is terrible. The stuff on Latin America is not bad because they do actually use a lot of reliable sources of data to make valuable points. But
Yeah.
every bit of opinion is well, it's anti-fascist,
Yes.
anti-dictator,
Yes.
pro-environment all the
Yes.
time. But
Yes.
it's loathing of labor, especially
Yes.
organized labor. And by
Yes.
labor, I don't mean the
Yes.
Trump
People who
incarnation
work.
of Tory
Yes.
Blair. It,
Yes.
it loathes the labor
Yeah.
movement. It
Yeah.
loathes any organized labor. And that is, it's
Yeah.
just gut wrenching all the time.
Yes, no, that's true. That's true. It also has the tone of the Economist. I always find slightly different. It's slightly more. Um, of course, it's apparent to writers on the Economist that such and such a thing is the case. It's got a slightly more kind of declamatory tone. I always feel the
Yeah.
FT's tone is slightly more playful. So there's something about the Economist that slightly wants you make to punch them slightly more. But I completely agree that if you've been off the planet for a few weeks, as it were, and you came back, and a copy of The Economist would kind of at least tell you what's going on in the world.
It would tell you what's going on in the world. I don't think there are a lot of kids from Compos working for either of them.
Also, I don't no, I don't think there is either. But I imagine working at the FT is much more of a laugh than working at The Economist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my father was a correspondent for 25 years for The Economist.
Was he? Did he say it was much of a laugh?
In these were the days when nothing there was signed. Increasingly, little by little,
Yes, that's true. They used to have. They were never signed, were
they
they?
were never signed. Now they have, invited columns, but sometimes they do sign things or they say who the new Badgett is or whoever it might be amongst these bizarre names they give to their correspondents.
The people on the podcast, of course, can't see that you're doing scare quotes, but I can.
Yeah. He was a just the facts man.
Right.
Very
Yes.
straightforward.
Yes.
And he wasn't in the office and he was part of their overseas stringers. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yep. Yep.
Yes. But because he worked there for 25 years, I grew up with an affection for it. I used to go to the post office with him when he would reply to their cables with his story.
How lovely.
Yeah, we would go to the cable office in the middle of the night when he'd finished his story and off it would go, and I enjoyed that ritual.
I bet. Yeah.
However, sadly, this is meant to be about you less than about me. Although I'm trying as hard as possible to steer it towards moi. Tell us about what is going on at the moment in the cultural/creative industries discussions, because I hear, is it Lisa Nandy who's the sort of relevant minister?
She is the relevant minister, indeed.
I hear her talking a lot, but I don't understand a lot of what she's saying.
Yes. Well, I suppose one of the things, getting back to your question, which I didn't fully answer about energizing and whatever the other term was, inhibiting, I think there's a lot of kind of sense at the moment in that area of policy and maybe more broadly in the culture and in politics of kind of rehashing of things. We seem to be in an endless kind of rehashing of things. I heard, as an aside, that in the UK, the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, recently made some kind of half-hearted, one might say, attempt to take over the leadership of the Labour Party.
He's on manoeuvres, I think is the saying.
He's on manoeuvres. Right? And as part of his being on manoeuvres, he said something like his policies would be nationalisation of key industries and wealth taxes kind of thing, which is, broadly kind of fine, I suppose. But I did I was really struck by the thought of thinking at the time, God, you could have said that in 1945 as your Labour Party platform. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's kind of like the sense of stasis in these things, I think, is really, really strong. I mean, not on the right, where it's, rapidly chaos and kind of activity and massive ramping up of far right politics. But in some ways on the left and the centre left, there does seem to be a little bit of kind of stasis sometimes in these things. Lisa Nandy, absolutely. It's a sort of rehashed, and a lot of things that happen with this current Labour government feel like rehashed versions of the 90s and noughties new Labour government with less money around. So she's doing the policies that kind of similar. It's a bit of creative kind of economy. There's a little bit about the importance of culture because, of course, Labour governments are always more likely to state that it's important in its own right, but there's not really any money associated with that. There's a little bit of rehashing of things, and it's mostly around economic growth, which is a rationale for everything, including the reason why we have a health service, apparently, because if people get sick, they can't go to work.
Well, that was why it started.
Yes, I know, indeed, and in a way, but I don't think anyone who uses it really thinks of it as a kind of just purely as a back to work service.
No, they've lost that. But it was, the guy who breaks his leg at the factory.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But we always did, we did treat kids and give them vaccinations and old people and things like that. We didn't just treat members of the labour force, did we?
Old people were people who were younger than we are, Kate.
Yeah.
Nobody our age was alive except for Churchill.
So yes, it's kind of slightly back to the future, but with less money. And weirdly enough, she didn't get reshuffled in the last reshuffle that we had, and there seemed to be some, she must know somebody, or there must be some reason. I think it's the usual thing is they don't care enough about the culture minister to even bother to reshuffle them, really.
So one of the things that she does talk about is, although this is too long a word to be used by a Labour politician, decentralisation.
Yes.
It obviously Salford and Cardiff aren't enough. And obviously she doesn't want anything in Bristol or Belfast. She wants everything to be where people might vote for the Insurgent Reform Party.
Yes. I mean, that's obviously animating a lot of the concern at the moment, is what to do in what are sometimes and rather horribly called left behind areas. Question of who left them behind, of course, is the pressing one. So yes, I think a lot of it is about, but they're kind of stuff. They realise, I think, that there's a kind of fundamental problem about the policies from the 90s onwards, which is if you do apply that kind of model for economic growth. So you say you're going to invest in the media industries in order to get economic growth. That is going to happen where it happens in large cities. And it's mostly going to happen in London and the southeast of England. If you want the money to be elsewhere, you kind of either have to redistribute it and do something else, or you kind of have to accept that this is not a growth policy, but it's in fact a policy about people's lives. It's about association. It's about cultural expression. It's about something else. But because they have this narrative that it's about growth, but they're still going to, in a way, from a growth perspective, you would not invest it in, Middlesbrough, because you're not going to get a lot of growth, probably, because you're not going to get a big enough economic effect. You would put it all in the big cities, which in Manchester and London and Glasgow and stuff like that. But they can't do that. So it's incoherent to a much greater extent than it was previously, I think.
In another wonderful British political historical term, settlement, how much influence on cultural policy does Holyrood have?
It has the budget for Scottish cultural policy, basically. So cultural policy is a devolved matter in the UK. It's devolved to Wales, it's devolved to Northern Ireland when they have a government, and it's devolved to Holyrood in Scotland. So yes, that is a Scottish. I mean, obviously the budget how much money they have to spend on these things comes from Westminster. So all devolution, in a sense, is doing what you can with the money that you've got, which you get centrally anyway. But yes, it's a devolved matter, and it's different in, it's I would say the difference is not huge between the different nations on what their kind of policies are. They all have a creative industries, creative economy kind of story, because they're all looking for the same, almost mythical economic growth that they're going to get out of it. In Scotland, I think there is less of certainly under the Tories, the last Tory government in Scotland, there was less of a really almost anti-intellectual culture. So there is a sense here that, yes, it's fine. A country the size of Scotland should have a national theatre. It should have museums. These things are to some degree seen as something that a nation should have. And of course, as a sort of national party, although nationalistic party, telling the story of the nation to itself and discussing the story is obviously kind of important, but it looms less in cultural policy than you might expect it to. I sort of thought that might be more the case here than it is. I think maybe Wales, it's a similar kind of thing where there is, cultural funding that does more. It does more about language, different languages. It does more about telling the nation's story. So it has that inflection, which you don't really get in England. But you still get the same kind of creative industries policies, largely speaking, around, as I say, the desire for somewhat kind of mythical growth. What you do get here that I think makes a difference, though, is that we still have, we don't have undergraduate fees. We don't have university fees for students too. So you can still go, if you're a Scottish student, you could still go to the Glasgow School of Art and get 3 years of higher education and not end up with a 90 grand debt. So in that sense, I think that makes a difference to cultural consumption, I think.
In terms of education, then, picking up on that topic, do you discern a difference between the students who are Scottish versus not Scottish at Glasgow, and the difference between the students you taught in Northern England and Southeastern England versus the Scottish ones?
I didn't really teach undergraduates very much when I was down south, as I now refer to Newcastle as down south. When I was in England, I didn't really teach undergraduates very much. I did a little bit in Leeds. Are they different? You get Glasgow traditionally had a lot of students from the west of Scotland coming, and you still get a few. So you get probably more local students maybe than you do in England. When I taught in Leeds, you didn't get many students from the north of England. You tend to get students from the south of England. I don't know why that was the case. I don't discern massive differences, no, not really, but except the students are at home. And I mean, I suppose, you might expect, because people haven't paid undergraduate fees or they're not under a terrible debt burden, that they might be less anxious in some ways. But I can't say I see that manifesting, because they seem fairly anxious in the same way that students, everywhere else are, really.
Yeah, sure.
For whatever reason. So I wouldn't say it was I've noticed a massive difference, other than you get more local students.
And in terms of Scottish culture, it's not got the number of speakers that is the case in Wales.
Correct.
It's more dominated by English than Wales is. I think it's fair to say.
It is, but so Gaelic speakers, tiny. It's a tiny number of Scottish Gaelic speakers that there are. Native Gaelic speakers, absolutely tiny. There is a sort of Gaelic school in Glasgow, which I think, as far as I know, is mostly sort of middle class English people sending their kids there because they like the idea, as it often is. Hobsbawm, etc., will tell us that the learning of kind of native languages is often the middle classes of a particular country. It was the same in Ireland for a long time before they made it part of the school curriculum. It's part of the school curriculum in Wales. It's definitely not in Scotland, but it's a much more of a minority language. The difference in Scotland is that most people speak it's standard English, but with Scots. The Scots language is much more part of it. So the way people speak is much more. It's a sort of, I don't hesitate to say dialect, but you know what I mean. It's a version of English.
It's very distinctive, and there is BBC. There's still BBC Alba, right?
Yeah. That's still going. Yes.
And
yes.
In that sense,
and the SNP, I think is. I mean, the school here where I work, the university, the School of Humanities, is well, you'll see if you ever get an email from anybody, will have their name in Gaelic underneath. It's allegedly bilingual. Road signs are bilingual. Place names are bilingual. I could, and may do when I retire, do free Gaelic lessons at the university. So there is an attempt to keep the language alive, but I just don't think it's ever been very widely spoken outside the Western Isles, and was never the language of sort of Eastern Scotland or the Lowlands. So it's never really been the national language in the way that Irish was, or Welsh really is.
Yeah.
So I think that makes a difference really to the politics of it.
So in terms of what makes it distinctive there from England, obviously there are lots of Englands in terms of accent, for example,
Yeah.
and industry. In such a small country as England, it's amazing how much variety there is.
Incredible. Well, I mean, if you're English, I think you find it incredible that there isn't variety in other places, rather than because you're so used to the variety of English accents, and sometimes it seems amazing that doesn't exist elsewhere, really.
One of the differences native speakers of English who are not British, one of the difficulties they encounter is that other than some Geordies, they can understand every English accent. They can understand Welsh accents. Some Scottish ones are places where, to coin an expression, English completely disappears, as with some Geordies. And so there are some people from the United States who cannot understand people, particularly from the Highlands, at all.
Yes, I always think, yes, I mean, this is what people say this, but I think you just there's a few kind of key phrases and words that people use, and once you know them, you can kind of get what people are saying. Do you know what I mean? So there is a kind of key to it. Also, I think that people, I don't know, always feel that's slightly exaggerated, but maybe it's not. Maybe you're right. Maybe people.
Well, I'm just talking about
never found Scots people hard to understand.
No, nor have I. I'm talking about US girlfriends.
Are they a very particular subset in this case, though?
Well, they're just my source. If I don't, and I haven't had a US girlfriend for a long time, but when I did, if Gordon Strachan was interviewed, not a jot could be understood. Every syllable had to be restated by me. If you
But if it was, say, Ali McCoist, they would have been all right. Or not to mention, Sean
yes,
Connery.
That's right. With Ali McCoist, they would have been fine, as they would be with anybody from Wales or Northern Ireland, or most people from Sunderland and Newcastle. If they were listening to Gaza, they wouldn't understand a word. And actually, even I have some difficulties understanding Gaza.
Whereas sadly, if they were listening to Alan Shearer, they would understand every boring word that he was saying.
Yeah, that's the trouble. You don't want to understand that. Or Gary Lineker. Gary Lineker, of course, has tailored his accent. He does not sound the way he did before he left for Spain. So he had a very clear Leicester accent, and it's all gone now. He's a nice man from the southeast.
Okay, I don't remember the Leicester days.
Oh yeah, if you go on YouTube and look up, Gary Lineker moves to Barcelona.
Okay.
Because you'll see a fabulous interview with wife number one, who has fabulous big hair.
Right.
And Gary saying "je" all the time. Manager, Leicester.
Oh yeah.
East Midlands elements. And it's all
What's an accent you ever had yourself, I imagine, Toby? Did you ever have
I did have those things, yes, when I was very young. Yeah. I mean, I suspect it was probably cross-class. When I was on the Research Excellence Framework panel for Britain last time, a book that I thought was fantastic was one of the things I read, which was the history of East Midlands pronunciations.
Really?
Probably a small readership, but I really enjoyed reading it, for narcissistic reasons. Anyway, in terms of your own work, so you moved into academia in a sense from doing policy consultancy.
That's correct. Yes.
To say?
Yes, that is. That's absolutely fair to say. Yeah.
So could you tell us about that point when you moved from having been by education a literature person into becoming a major policy wonk and then a prof of those things.
Okay, so this is all it's going. Anytime you narrate these things, they sound more conscious than they, of course, are as experienced, aren't they? They're kind of a series of rather random happenings, I think. So yes, I started. I'm trying to think now. So the first job I did out of university, if we have time for this before we get cast off the desert island, first job I did out of university was because, weirdly enough, when I left university in 1983 with my English degree, and Britain was in the depths of the Thatcher recession, there weren't that many people around wanting to hire me for my knowledge of, I don't know, Philip Roth or whatever it was. So I went and did
And a good thing too.
I went and did a postgraduate qualification funded by the state in artificial intelligence.
Oh, heaven.
At the University of Edinburgh. And this was it was kind of set up in the like, as I say, under the Thatcher government. It was called the ALVI program, if I remember rightly, and it was aimed at arts graduates who would otherwise be hanging around, being useless, to get them into the sort of white heat of the technological age. And a couple of these, one in Sussex and one in Edinburgh, were in AI. So Edinburgh was a very, very, one of the sort of foundational work on AI was kind of done. I have no idea why I think I like the idea of Edinburgh. I don't know why. I didn't know nothing about AI or anything to do with computers at all when I first arrived there. And when I got there, I realized I was actually the only person who actually came from an arts background. But anyway, so I did this course in AI, and then I screwed it up. I didn't get the master's degree. They gave me a diploma and just sent me away in the end because I just couldn't do anything. One of the courses involved trying to design a silicon chip. You had to kind of do your own. It was just insane. And there was another course that was like phonetics, which I could sort of understand, to do with natural language processing. But most of the time, I had no idea what was going on. It was just absolutely bewildering. So I got this degree, and then I thought, what can I possibly do with this combination of, my two degrees? Well, that's time was 1985, and the economy is slightly improving. So I went into computer journalism. That's a long way of answering that. My first job was in computer journalism, writing about IT as a journalist in what we used to call the trade press, which involved lots of kind of junkets at the time because people were always launching new products and there was kind of helicopter. It was just insane. So this was kind of 80s boom. I think of it as my 80s boom years, where there was kind of lots of launches of new versions of Lotus 123. And I actually got in to interview not only Michael Dell, but also Steve Jobs on one of these things. So anyway, so I did that for a few years. And then after that, I worked for various kind of technology analyst companies, and that I got me interested in kind of policy work through an organization called Policy Studies Institute, which was a sort of independent institute doing work on policy in London. And then I fundamentally become interested in public policy, I suppose, how public policy works, economic development. I had never been very interested in technology, and even less in AI, although I do slightly feel I should have gone in there for the boom. But it would have been a long time, I mean, God, it was like 40 years ago, So anyway, so then I did kind of policy work on my own for various organizations, did kind of research on, I suppose, economic development policy, public policy, and kind of got into cultural policy slightly accidentally. But I worked for myself, so I worked for various organizations and for myself for about 15 years doing kind of freelance consultancy, really, because there was quite a lot of it around, partly because of the new Labour government spending quite a lot of money on those kind of things. And then started to write, I suppose, slightly more critically about it, I would suppose, and possibly slightly more academically, although I don't really remember when that kind of switch happened. I'm quite a good voice switcher. I can write in different voices, if you know what I mean. So I remember that being a sort of conscious switch, but I didn't find that particularly hard in that sense. So yes, that's how I got into writing about cultural policy, really, through policy, and policy through some weird stuff about information technology, knowledge economies, I suppose, all that kind of stuff that was around in the 80s and 90s. And as I say, a brief dalliance with AI.
This is also that period in Britain in the mid to late 80s when traineeships are being created.
Yeah.
With the idea that you can, as part of the deindustrialization of the country, create a path for the working class into the service or cultural sector akin to apprenticeships in
Yes, yes,
manufacturing, right? That's
indeed.
when
Yes,
Peter
something that's
Kirby and all those people at the wonderfully named Manpower Services Commission.
Services Commission. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And also things like the dole, obviously, and the other kind of monies that people used to get, and who also then often worked in the creative industries. So yes,
Right.
it was a time of massive, deindustrialization that was incredibly brutally carried out
Yeah.
in Britain, but with some at the fringes mildly ameliorative policies.
Yes.
To deal
So,
with it.
we're going to give hairdressers a different kind of qualification.
Exactly,
We're going to
exactly.
give footballers a
Because
different
we
kind.
know there'll be more hairdressers and fewer miners.
Yeah, right, right. So this is happening in the 80s and early 90s, but the real takeoff of the sale of the idea of culture and creativity comes in part from the left, with the Livingston people at the Great
Yeah,
Lakes
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Council,
yeah, yeah,
Justin Lewis
yeah.
and others. And then it gets adopted in a more commercial frame by the Blair government. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes, I would say that's true. I think with the Blair government, was it a more commercial frame, or was it a more directed kind of towards economic growth? I'm only distinguishing between those two things because it wasn't. I think the Livingston policy was about intervening through the market, recognizing that the market's always done a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the production of culture, and that therefore a cultural policy had to deal with markets. And whereas prior to that, the cultural policy had been dealing with things that were not produced in the market in the first
Right.
place.
But wasn't it also about, there aren't enough girls, there aren't enough people of color,
Yes,
it's
yes, yes.
bloke
Or
dominated.
yes,
That was
or
part of the
rather, there
Livingston
are
policy.
those things, and they're making really interesting culture, but nobody's sort of, it needs support just in the
Yeah.
same way that we
Yeah.
give support to other forms of culture. I think a little bit of that lived on in the New Labour policy. It wasn't completely extinguished, but it was completely overtaken by kind of largely economic rationales, which, as I was saying earlier on, kind of drive out everything else. Because if what you fundamentally want to do is have more jobs and more growth, you don't really have a policy which is about self-expression or marginalized communities or any of those kind of things. They kind of ultimately end up working against each other. And because even in the late 90s, it's worse now, but even in the late 90s, economic ideas about what to do about European countries with to get any economic growth were thin on the ground. I mean, they're still thin on the ground in a way. So I mean, they were kind of, I think it became over time more of a kind of centrally economic idea than it possibly have started out at. And just as now, it was supposed to do a lot of the kind of amelioration of the terrible economic and regional divides that we have in this country as a result of said industrialization. So it had kind of a lot of things that it was supposed to do, but fundamentally it ended up, in a series of kind of property-led booms in the larger cities and a growth of jobs in the media, I suppose, at least for a while before they started rapidly diminishing.
And you're riding this boom, but you're not really a cheerleader. Many of your collaborators were cheerleaders. From my point of view, you were always more skeptical.
Yes, I was always more skeptical about it, but it was a sort of, as I say, I still think, I think there's one of the things that kind of frustrates me at the moment, this is a very long answer to your question, but one of the things that frustrates me at the moment is I still feel that on the left, there's not enough thinking about the economy. There's not enough economic thinking that goes on in terms of ownership, labor, who owns what goods and services should society produce, how should it distribute them, who should own them, those kind of questions. That was an attempt to think about a particular part of the economy. And I think in that sense, I have probably a little bit more, I don't see it entirely critically as being such a terrible idea, because it reminds me that, leftist governments or centre-left governments, which at least at that point trying to think about what should happen in the economy rather than simply doing what they're doing now, which is to kind of throw up their hands and have very few ideas about what we should do, how we should do it, who should own it, etc. But as I say, it was kind of hijacked early on. I was more skeptical about it because I recognized, because I did a lot of work in local areas in different regions, in different parts of the country, where people did hold out quite a lot of hope for the fact that investment in these kind of sectors would bring back some kind of, work. It would bring back some kind of prosperity. It would lead to some kind of interesting things happening in their towns and cities. But when you went around the country doing this kind of work, you realized that clearly wasn't the case. That wasn't going to be happening, other than a very few hotspots, which would very rapidly kind of overheat, and that you would never get this more even balance kind of thing if you were purely going for an economic payoff. So that problem was there, really.
I remember an unnamed, unmemorable Tory minister when they first got back into power in 2010, saying after a study trip to the United States, he couldn't understand why Birmingham, Alabama had television stations, but Birmingham, UK didn't. I remember thinking, one way to ponder that would be to look at a map.
Yes.
And then when you look at the map and when you think about the topography of the United States, you might understand why local television was a bit more important than in your pitty little island.
But Birmingham, of course, did have television stations. It had Pebble Mill. It had all of these parts of the country did have regional cultural economies, but they just couldn't be defended economically. They could be defended democratically and culturally and socially. And had the Tories done that in the first bloody place, they wouldn't have disappeared. If you see what I mean.
True.
But they could never be defended by the rationales that were being laid out for them. That's the thing.
And what about the attempt to decentralize, which I think is worthy in lots of ways?
Yeah.
Doctor Who being made in Wales, for example, Radio Bloke in Media City, and so on. There's something to be said for that, but it does seem to me fruitless as an overall strategy because, as you were saying earlier, capitalism works through cities, through big cities where powerful people make powerful decisions and have gigantic retinues of workers to serve them right across the class structure. And, the West End is not in Berwick.
No, exactly. And in Britain, we have an incredibly centralized political culture. I mean, incredibly centralized. It's not just capitalism, but also our political institutions, our cultural institutions are all very centralized. So you can move elements of, you can move sport out of actually sport's one of the areas where it works better, because a lot of the sport power is actually not in the London and the southeast of England unusually, but in other cultural areas obviously it is. And in politics you can move BBC journalists around the country, but they're always coming back to Westminster to find out what's happening, because that's where the decisions get made. So it's not a decentralized political culture, and therefore it's quite hard to have a decentralized media, really, I think. But as I say, I think sport is slightly different from that in that sense, because
Well, yeah, I mean, rugby league is the obvious example because it's such a northern sport.
It is, but I mean, not even in the Premier League, a lot of the dominant clubs are not, apart from the awful Arsenal, are not in the south, are they?
Well, I hear what you're saying, but Arsenal and Chelsea, that's quite a lot of Premier League titles. London has more clubs in the Premier League by far than any other city.
Yeah, but it's got more clubs than any other city. Of course, yes, it has. But I mean, if you looked at the last, the dominant club has been Manchester City, which is in Manchester. Before that, Manchester United was extremely dominant. Liverpool's had periods of dominance. So there's great strength outside of the capital to a much larger extent than there is in non-sport.
But it's in two cities. It's Liverpool.
Yeah, I suppose it's a northwest thing.
Nowhere else. Pardon me. But pardon me, I hear what you're saying. I do get it. And of course, the other thing is a lot of the talent comes from London. A lot of the Black British players in the Premier League are from South London. Yeah. Not far from where you used to live. I'm sorry. Hit's cough button. And of course, the players are now from elsewhere too.
Yes.
That's an interesting change.
Yes.
When you were growing up, right next to Anfield, I think.
Yes.
Were most of the players from Merseyside?
Yes, they were. Well, no, we're from Merseyside. No, we always had lots of Scottish players. Remember the first? There was, is there not some factoid about one of the first Liverpool teams had like 8 Scottish players or something? I mean, we're
Well,
going
there
back a
was
long
that
way. There was
connection.
a massive, it was
Yes,
a big connection
there
to
was a
Scotland
Northern Ireland
always.
connection to Manchester
Northern Ireland
United,
connection,
and a
so they
Scottish.
weren't. No, they were mostly British, I suppose. When I in the 70s, yes, they would have been mostly British in
But
Anfield,
there
and they
was Ian
came,
St. John, Ron Yates,
yeah.
for
And
example.
as I've written about quite recently, they came and they stayed in boarding houses around where I lived, and they were kind of almost part of the community. And they went to the betting shop when I was a student, and they were much more part of ordinary life. Footballers in the 70s and even into the 80s, I would say, in the cities where they worked.
Now, tell us. You said you've just written about this. I don't know about that. Tell us.
Okay, I wrote about a couple of how long ago is it now? Maybe 18 months ago. I wrote a piece about. It was in a magazine, a sort of online magazine. I can send you the link if you want at some point. About the idea of communal luxury. So the special issue was about the idea of communal luxury. So the idea of, from the Kirsten Ross book, Communal Luxury, about the idea of the importance of civic and public facilities, spaces, activities. That's what the book's about. And the idea that these things should be brilliant. They should be, beautiful and incredible. So people wrote articles about Lidos, for example, outdoor swimming pools, as we would call them, those kind of things, lovely bus stations, fantastic. And I wrote a piece about growing up next to a football club, in my case, Liverpool, and the way in which in those days, I mean, now if you go to Anfield, and it's not just Anfield, lots of Premier League clubs across Britain, they will look like kind of spaceships that have landed in some kind of generally small working class area of the city. Most of them haven't moved from where they are, unlike in the US. Football clubs don't move as much. And if they do, they don't move very far. So, I mean, Anfield looks like it's massive now. It always loomed very large, even as a child, but it was kind of human scale in some way. And now it's kind of massive. And we used to go and watch Liverpool train. We could go, and when the kids used to hang out, we could watch Liverpool train. You could walk up to the ground. When I think I say in this piece, when I hurt my hand one day in a door, my mum took me up to Anfield to be seen by a medic.
Wow.
Rather than taking me to now that was partly because my uncle at the time worked there, but she kind of carried me in. I have a very strong memory of it, and they sat me down and kind of bound up my finger, and she took me home again because our doctor was a bus ride away and Anfield was really, really close. So it was and that was a peculiar experience, but everybody knew footballers. The lady down the road had some of them kind of lodging with her. They were around. And they were part of the community, and the ground itself was just more permeable. You could go in at what was a 3/4 time, when after 3/4 of the game had gone, when people started leaving. If you're a kid, or anybody, you could get in for free.
Yeah,
so
like
you could watch the last quarter of the game for free, and you could just wander in. And all those kind of ways, it was just much more kind of permeable and part of your ordinary kind of life. And I suppose what I wanted to talk about in that was. And that was always, even then, it was a commercial organization. It wasn't doing it for. It probably nowadays has more of an explicit written down social mission than it had then. But then it didn't really kind of need one. It was just kind of there in a sense, and it was much more permeable to the community. But it was still, because this was the 70s and Liverpool was a great team in the 70s, it still had that idea of kind of luxury. But it was sort of on your doorstep. You could go in for free and watch, Kevin Keegan and Kenny Dalglish play. It was amazing.
And speaking of football, you do have a recent scholarly article.
Yes.
That is about the planned, now apparently, but actually probably not, discarded Super League.
Yes.
Here. And the power of the fan is often heralded as a triumphant ability to counteract capital. Can you tell us a bit about that story and also your take on it in the piece?
Yes. Okay. So the reason I was interested in writing it was because it took place, for people who don't know what the European Super League is, it was simply an attempt to get successful European clubs to play each other more often in a Super League rather than play fundamentally in their domestic leagues and then have these cup competitions, which take place alongside that kind of thing. But the one of the moves to set up this Super League happened during kind of lockdown. So it was partly that we were all locked in, essentially. It was during the COVID pandemic. We were all locked in. And into this lockdown world, where sport had only just come back on the television. We can remember for a while, the worst bit of lockdown, there was no sport at all on television. It was horrendous. And then I think we got the Bundesliga for a bit. And then anyway, sport came back and it was largely played in empty stadiums. It was extremely strange. But into this world of that kind of lockdown thing, the idea of the European Super League burst. And it was a very, very short, very condensed fan reaction. As I say in the piece, it was a fan reaction that chimed with, interestingly, the reaction of current and former players, in many cases, managers in many cases, the football establishment and the football fan in the street, as it were, particularly of these Premier League clubs who were going to be involved in this, were for a moment kind of joined in this kind of, I don't know if we call it cross-class, but certainly across wealth, kind of consensus about not wanting this Super League kind of thing to happen. And after about 3 days, 4 days, whatever it was, of various kinds of action, it did at least temporarily fold. So it seemed to me like an interesting example of a successful political action, albeit only temporarily kind of successful, and ones that we don't get very, very often in any sphere of life at the moment. And what I was interested in about it was that it was very explicitly political. It was very much about the idea of the people's game, one might call it. I mean, some people refer to it in more class terms, but the people's game in some way being appropriated. Now, obviously, the appropriation had happened ages ago. But at the same time, it was that feeling that people had that somehow, and it's the same point I was trying to make in the piece about communal luxury, I suppose, that even though their local football club may have become a global and globalized brand, it still retains some kind of connection to them and their neighborhood and their family and their history and those kind of things. And somehow those two things were held in tension. I mean, they're definitely held in tension, but they were just about holding together for a lot of people. And then they kind of burst apart in the idea of the European Super League. And this somehow offended what another writer describes as kind of moral economy of being a fan. It was almost like the kind of idea of this is too far, this is taken away from any sense of place that these clubs, for whatever reason, however enormously globalized they are, they still retain quite strongly. So it was that kind of idea that I was sort of interested in, why this had led to a political revolt, as it were, or at least a political backlash, and why it had been successful, and also why those things don't, I mean, the sort of appropriation of ordinary culture happens all the time. Depredations of working class life happen all the time. And yet this was the thing that sort of sparked it. And I was kind of interested in that, really, because a lot of the narrative from the fans really was about, the rich stealing from the poor, the appropriation of a kind of the people's game, very explicitly kind of political, and in some cases tied into other political things about privatization of water, all these other things were going on. So it seemed like a kind of moment of successful, I wouldn't necessarily call it leftist politics, because I don't think you could define it in that way, but at least class-conscious politics, and therefore worthy of just thinking about, really.
And part of the background to this is that in the British context, more and more clubs being bought by US owners who don't have to worry about relegation.
Yes.
And don't want to worry about relegation.
Yes.
Because they don't like competitive capitalism. They only like monopoly capitalism.
Yes, exactly. And that was, of course, the other thing about the Super League, which many of the people who weren't that politically bothered were deeply offended by, which was the idea that didn't have promotion and relegation. You were kind of a cartel, really, of clubs, and you would just stay there. And that may be de facto what happens in very rich sports, where all the money ends up in these particular clubs. But at least it's not quite the same as a de jure. There's not going to be any promotion or relegation kind of thing. Yeah, this did go against the spirit of, the idea that even big clubs can fall on hard times.
Now, Prof, I have one last question for you, but it's probably it is quite a big one. And after you've answered that, I'm wondering if perhaps we could conclude by your adding anything you want to And that might mean going over terrain we've already traversed where you wish to say something more, or it might mean a new topic. Yeah? Sound okay?
Okay. Yeah,
My
fine.
question
Yeah.
is, it's about Kate's boys, really, your young men. You know, you because one of your great skills, one of your many abilities is collaboration. And you've always got a retinue of young men with whom you write books and articles, although they're not so young now. Could you take us through some of those
Oh my God.
books? Oh, let's just focus on the books, right? Because you've written really important path-breaking books with your young men. You used to call them my young men. Maybe you don't call them that anymore. But I'm thinking of not I mean a lot
Actually,
of
just
articles.
in case any of these people are listening, I'm sure none of them are, but in case any of them are listening, I've never referred to them as my young men. I think the young men were actually another grouping, Toby, but
Oh,
nonetheless,
sorry.
that's all right. And nothing too much should be read into that either. But
No, no, I didn't mean to imply anything sexual, but I did think that there was one group that was your retinue, that was your young men. But I've got that
no, I'm denying any knowledge of this. If there ever was such a retinue, I'm absolutely denying any knowledge of it, and even under pain of torture, will not reveal any names. But not name any names, as they used to say. But do I do a lot of collaborative writing? Yes, I
yeah.
do a lot of collaborative writing. I've always liked collaborative writing, particularly book length things. I probably should be horribly ashamed of the fact that I've never written one on my own, but I don't really. I mean, I don't mind writing on my own, but I do like writing with other people. I think the
Mhm.
gender thing is probably accidental rather than deliberate. I don't think I went to seek out these people to write with, but I've always, yeah, I think I get kind of inspired by other people's ideas. I think it's nicer to write with other people. I'm generally a kind of extrovert rather than introvert. I don't particularly like sitting on my own in a room writing for very long. I like to kind of chat with people and do stuff with other people. I'd say in general, really. Yeah.
But sorry to push you a bit when I said that was the last question. Could you take us through a couple of those books?
Oh
Because
God.
I'm thinking, well, I can tell you the titles if that'll help.
Yes, go on.
So I'm thinking of a book you did with Dave O'Brien called Culture
Yes.
Policy.
Yes. Well, that
Uh,
was a sort of, yes, that was a kind of collection of things. So for a while, I've often had, for a while, I thought I'd probably try to do, this was not again, not conscious, it just so happened, one of every type of book.
uh-huh.
So you know how you get handbooks and you get other kinds of edited collections and you get kind of weird things. So for a while, it seemed like I was working on one of every kind of collection that Routledge or whoever published. So I've done books with Dave, yes, on that. But I think that's actually a collection of previously published stuff, the things that I did with Dave. I've always liked doing edited collections because I like asking people to write chapters and then writing just something about it. I've always really enjoyed. I've done quite a few edited collections, and I quite like writing for them. It's very frowned upon sometimes in the UK because I don't know why it's frowned upon, but it is. But I always enjoy it. I wrote a book about New Labour's cultural policy with Dave Hesmond-Halge and David Lee and Melissa Nisbet. That was 4 of us writing on that one. And then the last one I did, edited collection, I think was with Mark Banks, who just walked past and waved, but you couldn't see him, on the environmental crisis. So yeah, I've often co-written books with
You
people, and I
must
like doing it.
ask Mark about Leicester accents, actually.
Right. He
Because
also doesn't have a Leicester accent, though, does he? I
no,
don't
he
think he would
doesn't.
claim. No.
Doesn't. So the one with Dave Hesmond-Halge and
Yes.
these folks I don't know, David Lee, Melissa Nisbet, where you are credited as Catherine Oakley, which I really like and
Am I
approve of.
really? Oh
Yeah.
gosh. Okay.
It's called Culture, Economy and Politics, the
Yes.
Case of New Labour.
Yes.
And it's an insider and outsider approach.
Yes.
I think that's one of
Yes.
its many strengths. Now, I don't know your book with Mark, the environmental one. Could you share a bit about that with us, please? But
It
Mark is
was.
not a victim of the podcast. He's a survivor, as you are about to become.
It's an edited collection, basically. It's an edited collection of pieces on various. I'm going to reach a copy down for myself now so that I can tell you what's in it. Actually, hang on a minute. Yes, here we go. There you go.
Ah, impressive. Mm-hmm.
Yes, cultural and environmental crisis. We wrote about things. It was basically about how the sort of silence. I mean, you are have written far more on this than most people and know far more about it than most people. But aside from your good selves and some of your collaborators, there's very little written in kind of like media and cultural studies. Certainly there was a few years ago on the environmental crisis. And if there is, it falls into particular kind of camps. I think that was slightly our kind of point about it, was that in popular culture writing, there really isn't very much at all. And then there are these kind of, you get writing in the arts about the importance of the environment and environmental art and those kind of things, and you get the dreadful cli-fi and all those kind of things nowadays that we have to put up with. But there wasn't a lot, apart from your good selves, about the broader kind of cultural impacts, considerations, even policies around the kind of environmental crisis. So we commissioned, we did this book, and we got a few people to write for it about kind of different topics. Let me tell you what some of these topics are. One of them's about, we got ones about, for example, the environmental sustainability of the music industries in particular, something from Brett Carraway looking at Amazon's sustainability, something from Rick Maxwell on green accounting for a creative economy, new paradigms for creative cities, things like that. So various papers that looked at different kind of aspects of this, and an area which I still think is pretty patchily covered in cultural and media studies, although it's a lot better than it used to be.
And so the last thing is to invite you to add anything you want. As I said, it could be new material that we haven't touched on, or it might be reconsidering some of the issues we have mentioned.
What springs to mind? I suppose something about, I've been trying to think about recently. I'm writing a paper for a talk that I'm giving in Brussels next month, which is kind of where did it all go wrong? So some of the things we've been talking about, kind of cultural policy, and it's about the urban in particular. But I'm also trying to think a bit more about kind of new legitimations and new kind of ways of thinking about this. But as I say, I'm finding it quite difficult because there are a lot of kind of ideas around, but a general political sense of kind of stasis and despair. So the combination of those two things I'm rather struggling with. The attempt to be, if not optimistic, then at least hopeful in a very kind of hopeless feeling time.
Do you feel more hopeless now than you did in 1984 or 2012?
Yes. Yes, definitely in 1984. That's partly because I was like 21 or something.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to be I mean, it's not hard. Some people are hopeless at 21, but I was not hopeless at 21. And I didn't feel hopeless then. 2012, as in the sense of the global financial crisis, that kind of thing. Is that what you're thinking of? The Euro
and
crisis,
also the Tories entrenched in power.
Yes, the rise of the far right around Europe, and I think in the US situation was slightly different in 2012. That kind of thing leads to be more hopeless. But it's also, I think that as I say, I feel like on the left, while there's a lot of good thinking around a lot of areas, the kind of economic alternatives to our current predicament feel a bit underdone to me.
That's what I think you were mentioning earlier when you said you wanted more thinking about the economy.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think kind of actual alternatives to our current predicament, how different ways of running our economy, different modes of ownership, just different thinking about it. It feels like there's a lot of thinking at the moment, which is let's have wealth taxes, which I'm not at all opposed to. But even that is a tax policy, not an economic policy. And it kind of assumes that wealth is going to be generated in the same way, and that the best you can do is take it and redistribute it, which is fine, but it's quite limited. It's not thinking about a new kind of economy. It's just thinking about taking some of the surplus. And that seems to be, the thing that you come up against all the time from leftist politicians at the moment is we must, it's a redistribution argument, which is fine, but it is quite limited.
Yes. And we don't really have industry policy.
And we don't have industry policy, exactly. I mean, it's not like industry's gone away. It's not like we haven't got millions of people producing things all around the world in greater numbers than ever, but we don't really have industry policies. We don't really think about ownership very much anymore. I don't think, as I said about Andy Burnham, with let's just nationalize things. Do you know what I mean? We don't think about who owns things, what a lot of those things just don't seem to get the attention they deserve. And I don't know. I mean, it's not that I have any answers about that, but I suppose I find that a bit frustrating as someone
You
who
want that
gives.
more on the agenda, and it's
I'd
frustrating.
like it more on the agenda, yes.
Yeah. Well, Kate, thank you so much. We've been friends for close to a quarter of a century,
Yes, indeed.
and I apologize for referring to Kate's boys and your young men. I say this out of jealousy because I'm older than you, and I don't have a retinue of young scholars.
I don't have a retinue of young skulls. I'm just putting that on the record again.
But I've learned a lot from you from the first days of meeting you, and every one of your articles and books and reports that I've read has instructed me in very good ways. And I've also learned a lot from chatting to you today. So I thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And now I understand about the world of podcasting, so I've learned a lot.